Yes, no, maybe. I don't know. Can you repeat the question? You're not the boss of me now. You're not the boss of me now. You're not the boss of me now, and you're not so big. You're not the boss of me now. You're not the boss of me now. You're not the boss of me now, and you're not so big. Life is unfair.
Hey everybody, Alex the Critic here, and back in November of 2021, I uploaded a review of the Steven Universe Racism PSAs. In that review, I tore those PSAs apart for being blatant, poorly written propaganda. Why am I bringing this all up? Because the monster known as race baiting has reared its ugly head towards us once again, and this time, our target is a cartoon by the name of the Proud Family, Louder and Prouder. The Proud Family, Louder and Prouder is an animated sitcom created by Bruce W. Smith that was produced and released by Disney via their Disney Plus streaming service. The show, which is centered around the adventures of a young black girl named Penny Proud, is actually a revival of an earlier series that aired for 2 seasons on the Disney Channel from 2001 to 2005. While the older series, which was simply named The Proud Family, was, and still is, beloved by audiences, though I myself didn't care much for it, the revival has not been received as favorably. But Alex, professional critics love this series. Yeah, and if I actually gave a shit what professional critics thought, that would mean something to me. One of the many reasons why this show has been poorly received by audiences is because it pushes radical racial politics in a heavy-handed and unenjoyable manner. And if you want evidence of that, then let me show you some clips from the show's Season 2 finale, which is appropriately titled Juneteenth.
Oh, you understand, love, don't you?
No, I do not understand anything about white fragility.
White fragility? What's that supposed to mean?
You know what it means. You're doing it right now.
Doing what?
Being defensive about race. Robin DiAngelo wrote a whole book about it. Read it.
Your dad wouldn't even look at the diary. He said his people would never own slaves. How could he just dismiss me like that?
White fragility.
Oh, Brother Kwame, what did Wizzy Kelly say?
And I quote, "Get over it. That was 400 years ago. Y'all."
Sounds like black fragility.
Christian A. Smith! His legacy is a myth!
Oh no.
Hey! What are you doing? Get over here!
No, Dad! We will not stop until that statue of that slave owner comes tumbling down! Why are you in riot gear? We don't see no riot here! Come on, y'all. Here come Wizard Kelly and his goons. Penny, stand your ground.
Why are you in riot gear? We don't
They
see
do
no
not
riot
intimidate us.
Barry, don't just stand there. Do something.
Let's go.
They're gonna arrest our baby. Do something with your white privilege.
As bad as those clips are, believe it or not, there is actually a far better example of this show's propagandizing. And if you've been browsing through conservative circles on Twitter and here on YouTube, then you'll already know what it is I'm referring to.
This country was built on slavery, which means slaves built this country.
That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I'm going to be covering the Proud Family's infamous Slaves Built This Country poem. Before I get started, however, here's some of the context behind it. Penny Proud and her friends Dejanay, Zoe, Maya, and Myron are delivering a slam poem about slavery and reparations to an auditorium full of people for what is presumably a talent show. Why don't I know for sure what they're doing this for? Because I haven't watched the episode that this poem was cut from, and I don't really care to watch it. Why's that? Well, it's a bit of a long story, but hell, we've got some time to spare, so why don't I tell it? Because this poem references the American holiday of Juneteenth, and the second season finale of Louder and Prouder is titled Juneteenth, I made the innocent assumption that it came from that episode. However, I was wrong. And I paid the price for that wrongness by sitting through one of the worst episodes of any cartoon I've ever watched. You think the clips of the episode that I showed you were bad? Honey, you don't even wanna know how much worse it is. That wasn't as long of a story as I thought it was gonna be. Anyways, because of how awful that episode was, I refuse to watch any more of them. And that includes whichever episode this poem came from. For those of you who will complain that I'm being dishonest for debunking the lies spread in this poem without first covering the episode that it spawned from, this is my rebuttal to you.
Jog on.
Alright Alex, that's fair, but if so many conservative pundits have already covered this poem, then why are you reviewing it? Didn't you say in your She-Hulk video that you don't like talking about popular topics? Good catch there, viewer. The reason why I'm covering this poem, even though it's already been done to death by numerous conservative commentators, is because while I like a lot of those other videos, especially the ones by Tree of Logic and Benny Johnson, I feel that they either missed or glossed over a lot of the other issues that this poem has. Which is why I'm here to make sure that those things get talked about. Now that I've got all of that out of the way, let's get louder with proud.
This country was built on slavery, which means slaves built this country.
Slaves did not build this country. Rich, white, religious British colonists who were well-versed in politics, philosophy, and warfare were the ones who built it. They were the ones who risked their lives to lead their brethren against the British Army during the Revolutionary War. They were the ones who drafted the laws that we still abide by 250 years later, as well as the systems of government that we still operate on. They were the ones who built the societal infrastructures that we rely on to this day. If you want to say that slaves built this country's economy, that would be fair, but one, that statement would only apply to the southern portion of the United States. Two, there are still several economists who would argue that slavery actually hindered the US economy. And three, that statement could just as easily apply to the African kingdoms whose power and influence stemmed directly from their willing participation in the transatlantic slave trade. So unless you want to acknowledge that, then spare me your whining.
Tilled this land from sea to sea to sea. First there was rice, tobacco, sugar cane. Then Whitney did his thing and cotton became king.
Amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
The first crop to be commercially viable in America was tobacco, not rice. Rice wouldn't even become a cash crop until the 1690s, 60-odd years after enslaved Africans were brought to the shores of America. As for sugarcane, America imported roughly half of its sugar from the Caribbean at the time of the Civil War. And while plantation-based slavery was practiced on those islands, we weren't the ones responsible for that. The French and the Spanish were. So if you want to yell at anybody about that, go yell at them. Oh. And although the first African slaves arrived in America in 1619, slavery wasn't legally established as an institution in the Americas until the 1660s. Up to that point, enslaved Africans were treated as indentured servants, meaning that they would only be forced to work the colonial plantations for about 5 or 6 years before being granted their freedom. What's more, white Europeans also made up a good portion of those indentured servants. And so it was indentured servants, not slaves, who would grow the first cash crops that would fuel colonial America's economy. And what's with this sea to sea to sea nonsense? California wasn't admitted into the United States until 1850, and even then, it was admitted as a free state, meaning that slavery wasn't permitted in it. Maybe before you go on an angry rant about the history of American slavery, you should actually, well, know a little something about the history of American slavery. Just saying.
We were its soldiers,
4 million strong,
fighting for America's freedoms even though we remained America's slaves.
Once again, it wasn't a bunch of slaves that fought the British during the Revolutionary War. As a matter of fact, a sizable number of slaves actually fought on the side of the British, because the British offered them freedom in exchange for their military service. It wasn't hundreds of thousands of slaves that fought and died in a brutal 5-year civil war for their emancipation either. It was white people that did that.
built this country. The descendants of slaves continue to build it.
You're damn right that the descendants of slaves have continued to build this country. Why? Just look at all of the building that they've done throughout the past 3 years.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Of looters going to different stores along Van Nuys Boulevard. You see them pouring. Look at this. Pouring out of this Boost mobile phone store after looting a pharmacy down the block.
Gentlemen, I have never seen anything like this. The building's beginning to collapse. The building is collapsing. The building just exploded. Oh my God. Oh my God, it's so hot!
I hope they keep burning the city down. I hope they reach white folks. I hope they reach their neighborhoods, because that's where this needs to be at. This is it, right? Like, this is the start of revolutions right here. This is government property. They need to burn all of it. All of it needs to be burned.
I don't give a damn if they burn down Target. Because Target should be on the streets with us, calling for the justice that our people deserve. Where was AutoZone at the time when Philando Castile was shot in a car, which is what they actually represent? Where were they?
According to a new study, the Black Lives Matter movement is linked to more than 9 in 10 riots across America. The study defines riots as demonstrations in which any demonstrator engages in violently disruptive or destructive acts as well as mob violence. According to the data collected by the U.S. Crisis Monitor, the U.S. experienced 637 riots between May 26th and the 12th of September. Out of these, 91% of those were riots linked to the Black Lives Matter movement. These include demonstrations that have a local BLM group involved, or when the main issue of the demonstration concerns police brutality against black people in general. The study found that 49 states experienced riots during that time period. California led the nation with 86 riots during that time, closely followed by Oregon with 79 riots during the same time period. The data also showed that 7% of Black Lives Matter linked events have in fact turned violent eventually.
If that's not cultural and economic enrichment, then I don't know what is.
Slaves built this country.
And we, the descendants of slaves in America, have earned reparations for their suffering. And continue to earn reparations every moment we spend submerged in the systemic prejudice, racism, and
White supremacy that America was founded with and still has not atoned for.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Oh, I've long wanted to cover the stupidity of reparations on this channel. Before I do, however, I'd just like to extend a solid fuck you to these guys for daring to suggest that they be paid reparations on behalf of people that they've never met and probably aren't even related to, for something that they've never even gone through. I'm not just talking about slavery here. Those systemic prejudices that these guys claim they suffer under? Yeah, those don't actually exist either, and let me explain how. Slavery was abolished with the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1865. Jim Crow laws, on the other hand, were abolished with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Both of those events took place far before any of these kids were born, so how exactly they've been the victims of discrimination is beyond me. Let's not forget that the vast majority of public and private institutions in this country are required by law to diversify their workforce. Let's also not forget that black people dominate several industries in our economy, such as the music and athletic industries. Last but not least, I'd like you guys to pay attention to the words that are written on this black person's palms. If you happen to be illiterate, the words in question are "hands up, don't shoot," which is a reference to the narrative that Black Lives Matter spun in the wake of Michael Brown's death. For those who don't know, Michael Brown was a black man from Ferguson, Missouri, who was killed by a white police officer named Darren Wilson on August 9th, 2014. Black Lives Matter, as well as several mainstream media outlets, ran with the idea that Brown was an innocent person who was murdered in cold blood by Wilson despite having his hands up and pleading "don't shoot," which is where the "hands up, don't shoot" slogan originated from. Unfortunately, when the Department of Justice conducted a probe into the incident following the violent protests that erupted after Brown's death, they concluded that this narrative was little more than a myth. Brown never held his hands up, and in fact, it was actually he who assaulted Wilson. It was also claimed that Brown was shot in the back while fleeing from Wilson, but that never fucking happened either. "Hands up, don't shoot" is a lie, and you people are fools for propagating it.
About the only systemic oppression that you guys have ever faced was somebody leaving a mean comment on one of your TikTok videos. Now that I've finished eroding you guys' faith in humanity, let me explain why reparations are a ridiculous pipe dream that would be almost impossible to implement. First off, who deserves reparations? Remember, not every black person currently living in America is descended from slaves. In fact, a growing amount of black people are actually descended from immigrants who willingly moved to this country. Also, because of how poorly the enslaved population of America was documented, it's actually really damn difficult to figure out how many of the black people currently living in this country are descended from slaves. So unless you want to invest the hundreds of millions of dollars that it's gonna take to uncover the historical roots of every black family currently living in America, we're not gonna be able to pay anybody anything. Furthermore, what if you're mixed race? Say your dad is a white person whose ancestors owned slaves, and your mom is a black person whose ancestors were slaves. Do you have to pay reparations to yourself? Does your dad need to pay you and your mom reparations? I kind of figured that he was already doing that by bringing you into existence and clothing you and feeding you and housing you and doing all of the other things that fathers normally do for their households, but I digress. Last but not least, white people were not the only ones who owned slaves. Native Americans also owned slaves, as did black people.
And the former didn't free theirs until 1866, a year after slavery was legally abolished in the United States.
Why was that? Because the 13th Amendment didn't apply to Native American reservations, which are treated as their own separate nations by the federal government. Are you guys gonna be demanding reparations from them? Yeah, didn't think so. Second off, who's supposed to pay these reparations? It's not like every white person that lived in antebellum America owned slaves either. Even in the South, slave owners only accounted for roughly 20% of the population. This actually led to a popular sentiment among Confederate soldiers that the Civil War was, quote, a rich man's war but a poor man's fight, because most Southerners had no interest in propping up an institution that they themselves enjoyed no benefits from. Plus, slaves vastly outnumbered slave owners in terms of population. You'd essentially be asking 20% of the white American population to pay reparations to 40 or 50% of the black American population. And that's if the slave owners we're talking about still have living relatives. Barring that, why should descendants of slave owners be forced to pay for something that they themselves never condoned or participated in? Do you know how fucked up of a thing that is to demand? That would be like forcing the great-grandchild of a murderer to pay reparations to the family of the woman that their great-grandparent murdered. Maybe the taxpayers could pay it, Alex. Well, why the hell should we have to pay for something that we never condoned nor participated in? Well, maybe we could have the government print out the money we need. Oh yeah, that's gonna go over real well. It's not like we're already dealing with some serious inflation. Say, I wonder what happened to the last country that flooded their economy with millions of dollars.
It's not easy being a dictator. For one, there's a lot of other people around you who would love to be you, so you're constantly worrying about staying in power. Navigating the gray area between political rivals and political allies is a total headache. Plus, there's all those pesky people who you're supposed to be in charge of. How to give them as little as possible without inciting rebellion is a never-ending balancing act. Robert Mugabe, the president of Zimbabwe, was facing these problems around 2000. He needed money to bribe his enemies and reward his allies. Unfortunately, he had taxed pretty much everything there was to tax, and his policies had scared away investors. The economy wasn't doing well, and his people were unemployed and hungry. So, where to get the money? Well, one of the perks of running a country is that you get your very own money-making machine, the printing presses. So, in a pinch, you can just print more money, which is exactly what Mugabe did. The newly printed money didn't increase productivity in the Zimbabwean economy, and there was no new investment, so the economy couldn't produce more goods. In effect, you had more money chasing the same goods. More money chasing the same goods meant that the purchasing power of the Zimbabwean dollar fell. You needed more dollars to buy the same stuff as before. In other words, as the newly printed money began flooding the market, prices began to rise. Prices began to increase at a rate of about 50% a year, and that was only the beginning. As prices rose, the government had to print even more money to buy just as many goods as before. And so they did. And that is how things got out of control. The faster prices rose, the more money the government printed. And the faster prices rose. A feedback loop. By 2001, prices were rising at a rate of 100% per year. By 2002, 200% per year. 2003, 600% per year. By 2006, prices were rising at over 1,000% per year, and it cost 417 Zimbabwean dollars to buy toilet paper. No, not per roll, $417 per sheet.
Third off, how much compensation are the descendants of slaves owed? What if your ancestors were only slaves for like a month? Would you receive the same amount of compensation as someone whose ancestors were slaves for a whole decade? What if your ancestors were treated kindly by their masters or were actually freed by their masters? Do either of those factors determine how much compensation you're owed? Fourth off, what kind of reparations are the descendants of slaves to receive? Do they get money, land, tax write-offs, debt relief, subway coupons? What? Also, do the descendants of slaves get to decide how the reparations are paid? And are you willing to spend the hundreds of millions of dollars that it's going to take to set up the offices and organizations that we're going to need to dole out these reparations? Why would we even spend all of this money on this horse hockey when there are about a bajillion other things that we could be spending it on, like stopping crime, taking care of our homeless population, or securing our southern border? In summary, reparations are a nonsensical idea that could only be peddled by morons who haven't thought about the logistics of it for more than 5 minutes. If they were going to be paid, they should have been paid to the slaves that were freed after the passage of the 13th Amendment. However, they weren't. And as shitty as that is, there's absolutely nothing that we can do about it at this point. Instead of grouching about historical injustices that we have no feasible way of righting, how about you focus on fixing the issues that are currently plaguing your community? What's the fatherless rate amongst blacks again?
Slaves built this country.
Not only field hands, but carpenters, masons,
Blacksmiths, musicians, inventors built cities from Jamestown to New Orleans to Banneker, Washington.
I'm sure you guys will be utterly shocked to hear this, but these guys got literally everything wrong.
Jamestown was an English colony founded by a 3-ship large crew of white colonists in 1607. The first enslaved Africans didn't reach it until 1619, by which time the colony was already thriving. New Orleans, on the other hand, was a French colony founded in 1718 by a guy whose name I'm not even gonna try to pronounce. Slaves wouldn't arrive there until the following year, by which time a good chunk of the city's infrastructure had already been built. As for Banneker's Washington, that line refers to Benjamin Banneker, an astronomer and land surveyor who mapped out the borders of what would eventually become Washington, D.C.
Don't know if I need to tell y'all this, but surveying the land that a city will eventually be built on is not the same as building the city. Benjamin Banneker didn't even do it alone, nor did he do it against his will. He was hired to assist a team of surveyors who were led by a white man named Andrew Ellicott. You wanna know the best part though? Benjamin Banneker was not a slave. He was born a free man, and he died a free man. Hell, we don't even know how much work he even did in Washington, D.C., as there's next to no documentation of his time there. It's amazing. I haven't seen a piece of media this historically inaccurate since Braveheart, and at least that film did us the courtesy of having some kick-ass action scenes.
I think the worst part about this verse is how poorly these guys explain what they mean by Banneker's Washington. The same goes for their lines about Eli Whitney. In the poem, Eli's contribution to history is described as, quote, "Then Whitney did his thing and Cotton became king." The quote-unquote thing the kids are referring to is Eli's invention of the cotton gin, a device that can pick seeds out of cotton faster than slaves could do it by hand. This machine made picking cotton a much more efficient and lucrative enterprise, and led to it becoming the primary cash crop produced by the southern United States.
If you didn't know about any of that before going into this poem, however, then the significance of that line would be totally lost on you, as these kids don't go into any detail about who Eli Whitney was or what he did. And that goes double for Benjamin Banneker, who I guarantee most of y'all have never heard of before now. How do these writers expect children to glean any historical information from what's supposed to be an educational poem when even I, as somebody who's well versed in history, had to Google who the fuck Benjamin Banneker was?
40 acres and a mule? We'll take the 40 acres, keep the mule.
For the last time, you guys have earned jack shit. If you want 40 acres and a mule, then go out and work for it, you lazy bums.
We made your families rich.
Stop fucking acting like you guys personally endured slavery. Y'all weren't slaves, y'all never have been slaves, and God willing, y'all never will be slaves. So take your petty grievances and shove them up your collective asses. Also, as I have already mentioned earlier, not every single white American living in the antebellum era owned slaves. Nor did every American in general. So you guys have quite literally not made everybody's families rich. Also, what about all of the white people whose ancestors immigrated to America after slavery ended? Did y'all make all of their families rich too?
From the Southern plantation heirs
To the Northern bankers.
to the New England ship owners, the founding fathers,
Former presidents.
current senators.
Okay, whoa. I understand how slavery enriched Southern plantation owners and the founding fathers, but how did it enrich ship owners, Northern bankers, and current day politicians? Are you going to explain the connection there to us?
The Illuminati, the New World Order.
Nope, you're just gonna make a stupid joke that doesn't even make that much sense. I should have expected as much.
Slaves built this country. We had Tubman,
Turner.
Frederick B.
Didn't they say Lincoln freed the slaves?
But slaves were men.
And women.
Alright, I know that Tree of Logic already made fun of this line in her response to this poem, but it bears repeating. Why did these kids feel the need to highlight that both men and women were slaves? Like, no duh? Thanks for the information, Captain Obvious.
And only we can free ourselves.
What does that even mean?
Emancipation is not freedom.
But it is. By definition, emancipation is freedom.
Jim Crow, segregation, redlining, public schools, feeding private prisons, where we become slaves again.
This whole verse is dumb. We got rid of segregation, Jim Crow laws, and redlining about 60 years ago, so I don't know what the hell you're going on about here. But that last line really gets on my nerves because of how infantilizing it is towards black people. Maya does understand that in order for somebody to end up in jail, they have to willingly break the law, right? It's not as though we're rounding up black high school graduates by the tens of thousands and carting them off to jail. They have to actively do harm to their fellow man to be put behind bars. How can you compare a system like that to slavery, an institution where innocent people were forced to do hard labor by those in power for a variety of different reasons? Do you even realize how much you're cheapening the meaning of the word slavery by invoking it in this context?
As we celebrate Juneteenth for the umpteenth time, our account is still outstanding.
I told the American government not to pay reparations out in Bitcoin.
Because this country was built on slavery, which means
slaves built this country.
I think these guys are operating under the logic that if you repeat a lie often enough, it'll become the truth. Gee, I wonder what other group of people used that logic to advance their cause.
soll vor sich hertragen und wir werden in unserem Zeichen wieder siegen.
Welp, can't think of any.
And we demand our 40 acres and a mule. You can keep the mule.
Keep the 40.
we're taking our freedom.
Well then, since you guys are already free, I guess that means that our country's debt has been paid off. I'm glad that we could resolve this so easily. I love how the crowd cheers after their performance too. That is the most blatant example of writers sniffing their own farts that you are ever going to see. On that note, good God, that was just terrible.
I'm serious, friends. I don't think I've ever seen something as offensive to my intelligence as this poem. These writers lied about every single fucking historical topic that they brought up. From the idea that slaves built America, to the hailing of Benjamin Banneker as a black inventor who, quote, built Washington, D.C. when he was a free man who merely surveyed the area upon which our capital would be built on. That a Disney show aimed at children would attempt to advocate for reparations while actively stoking racial tensions within them by painting America as an oppressive dictatorship run by white supremacists is unforgivable. And that's without mentioning how the producers explicitly show images of slaves picking cotton and Ku Klux Klan members burning crosses. Speaking of Disney, I find it really funny that Louder and Prouder is produced by the same company that thanked the country of China for allowing them to film part of their shitty live-action Mulan remake near the grounds of literal Muslim concentration camps. And hey, didn't Disney also edit Finn, a black character, out of the Chinese posters for their Star Wars movies because of how racist the Chinese are towards blacks? Aren't their parks also built on land that was stolen from Native Americans? Y'all are quite literally the last people on Earth that should be advocating for any form of reparations. Because if we were to operate on woke logic, y'all would be the first in line to pay them.
Give the Steven Universe PSAs about racism some credit, because at least they were fun to watch, even if only ironically. This dreck, on the other hand, is what I genuinely believe Satan makes you watch on a loop in the 11th circle of hell. To the people who wrote this poem, I dare you to move to a third world country and tell me that they are better places to live in than America is. Seriously, if America is really as bad as y'all describe in your poem, then why don't you just go and see what those greener pastures are like? As a matter of fact, I can think of no finer words to end this video with than what Ayan Hirsi Ali once told a slimy interviewer when debating the topic of Islamophobia in America.
You grew up in freedom and you can spit on freedom because you don't know what it is not to have freedom. I haven't. I know that there are many things wrong with America, and I know that there are many things that are wrong with Americans, but I still believe it's the best nation in the world.
I'm Alex the Critic, and I'll see you guys next time.